Each testimony builds a stronger case. Every sharp focus reveals clarity. Learning your legal rights, upholding unyielding justice.
My name is Eleanor Chambers.
You can verify that in 30 seconds.
A federal judge.
Right, and I'm the Pope. You people always got a story.
You people?
Empty your pockets now, or I'm taking you in for obstruction.
You have no grounds.
I said empty your pockets.
The wine aisle was quiet that Wednesday evening, soft jazz playing through the speakers of Harrington's Fine Foods, an upscale grocery store in the wealthy suburb of Millbrook Heights. The shelves were lined with bottles that cost more than some people's weekly groceries, and the clientele that evening was sparse, mostly professionals stopping in after work, browsing organic produce and artisanal cheeses. Judge Eleanor Chambers was among them, pushing a cart slowly through the aisle, reading labels with the careful attention she brought to everything in her life. At 58 years old, she had spent 22 years on the federal bench, presiding over cases that shaped civil rights law, sentencing corrupt politicians who thought themselves untouchable, and earning a reputation as one of the most respected jurists in the Eastern District. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, she was just a woman in a beige cardigan and comfortable slacks, tired from a long day of court proceedings, wanting nothing more than to pick up a nice bottle of wine and some ingredients for dinner. Her reading glasses sat low on her nose as she examined a Bordeaux, completely unaware that her quiet evening was about to become a nightmare, captured in high definition by 6 security cameras positioned throughout the store. What happened in the next 23 minutes would be broadcast across every major news network in the country, viewed over 47 million times online, and would ultimately dismantle an entire police department's culture of protection. Sergeant Dale Vickers, 44, pushed through the automatic doors of Harrington's Fine Foods at 7:43 p.m., responding to what dispatch had described as a suspicious person call from an anonymous source. He had 18 years on the force, a record his supervisors called solid community policing, and a sealed personnel file that told a very different story: 31 complaints over 15 years, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and systematic intimidation of minorities in public spaces. Every single complaint had been reviewed by Internal Affairs and dismissed as misunderstandings or unfounded accusations. Vickers had learned over nearly 2 decades that he could operate however he wanted as long as he claimed to be responding to legitimate concerns. His partner that evening was Officer Neil Grady, 29, 5 years on the job and known throughout the department for one defining characteristic: he never questioned anything Vickers did. He followed orders, backed his senior officers' reports, and had learned that silence was the fastest path to promotion in a department that valued loyalty over accountability. Vickers' eyes scanned the store methodically as he entered, moving past the white customers browsing near the entrance, past the elderly white couple examining produce, past the white businessman on his phone in the deli section. His gaze stopped when it reached the wine aisle and the only black customer in the entire store. Something about her, he would later claim, didn't fit the neighborhood profile. He couldn't articulate what that meant, couldn't point to any specific behavior that warranted suspicion, but his hand was already moving toward his duty belt as he walked directly toward Judge Eleanor Chambers, who was still reading the label on that bottle of Bordeaux, completely unaware that the next few minutes would change both of their lives forever. Vickers stopped 3 feet behind Judge Chambers, close enough that she could sense his presence before she turned around. His voice cut through the quiet jazz music with a tone that wasn't a question but an accusation. He wanted to know what she was doing there, why she was in this store, in this neighborhood, at this hour. Chambers set the bottle of Bordeaux back on the shelf carefully and turned to face him, her expression calm but confused. She explained simply that she was shopping, that she lived 12 minutes away, that she stopped here regularly on her way home from work. It was the kind of explanation no one should ever have to give for existing in a grocery store, but she offered it with the composure that came from 22 years of managing hostile courtrooms. Vickers wasn't satisfied. He demanded identification, his hand drifting toward the taser on his belt in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate. Chambers asked a simple, lawful question: why did she need to show ID when she hadn't committed any crime? The question was reasonable, constitutional, the kind of thing any citizen had the right to ask. But Vickers interpreted it as defiance, as a challenge to his authority that couldn't be tolerated. Grady shifted his weight uncomfortably behind his partner, recognizing something was wrong but saying nothing, doing nothing, failing in the most fundamental duty an officer has to the public. Chambers, drawing on decades of remaining unflappable under pressure, slowly moved her hand toward her purse to retrieve her wallet. The movement was deliberate, careful, non-threatening. But before her fingers even touched the leather, Vickers screamed at her to freeze, his voice echoing through the store as he claimed she was reaching for a weapon. Chambers stopped instantly, both hands rising to shoulder height, palms open and visible, explaining calmly that she was simply trying to comply with his request for identification. The contradiction was captured perfectly by 3 different security cameras, an officer demanding ID, then treating the attempt to provide it as a lethal threat. What happened next would be replayed in courtrooms, on news networks, and in police training seminars for years to come as an example of everything wrong with American policing. Vickers grabbed Judge Chambers by the shoulder and spun her roughly toward the wine shelf, ordering her to place her hands flat against the wood. The force of the movement knocked several bottles from the shelf, sending them crashing to the floor in an explosion of glass and red wine that spread across the tile like blood. The sound made other shoppers turn, made a stock clerk drop what he was carrying, made Grady take an involuntary step backward. But Vickers wasn't finished. He kicked Chambers' feet apart with his boot, forcing her into a position of maximum vulnerability and humiliation, then began conducting a pat-down search that went far beyond any standard procedure, his hands rough and invasive, deliberately degrading, the kind of search designed not to find weapons but to establish dominance and inflict shame. As his hands moved across her body, he muttered words that the security cameras would capture with devastating clarity. He said that, "You people always have an excuse," that she had picked the wrong neighborhood to cause trouble, that he could always tell when someone didn't belong. Chambers remained silent throughout the assault, her legal mind working even as her body endured the violation, cataloging every word, every action, every civil rights violation that was occurring. When Vickers finished his search and found nothing because there was nothing to find, Chambers spoke in a clear, steady voice loud enough to be captured by every microphone in range. She stated that she did not consent to this search, that she was complying under duress and threat of violence, and that she was a federal judge for the United States District Court. Vickers actually laughed, the sound cruel and dismissive. "Sure you are, sweetheart, and I'm the President of the United States." The commotion had begun drawing attention from throughout the store. The crash of wine bottles, the raised voice of Sergeant Vickers, the unmistakable tension that filled the air it pulled shoppers from other aisles like gravity, their ordinary Wednesday evenings suddenly intersecting with something they would never forget. Dorothy Ashworth, 71, a retired schoolteacher who had spent 4 decades shaping young minds in the public school system, stopped her cart at the end of the wine aisle and watched the scene unfold with growing horror. Her hand moved to her chest as she saw a woman her own age pressed against a shelf, being searched like a criminal while wine pooled at her feet. A young couple, Ethan and Mira Osei, both in their late 22s and still wearing their hospital scrubs from shifts at Millbrook General, recognized immediately what they were witnessing. Without a word to each other, both reached for their phones and began recording, capturing angles the ceiling cameras couldn't reach. Franklin Doyle, 54, a retired Marine Corps Master Sergeant who had served 3 tours overseas and now worked as a logistics consultant, stepped closer than the others, his military bearing evident in his posture. His voice carried clearly through the aisle as he announced that he was witnessing what appeared to be an unlawful assault on a compliant civilian, and that he was prepared to provide a sworn statement. Vickers' head snapped toward the growing crowd, his face reddening with anger at having his authority challenged. He pointed at them and warned that anyone who didn't mind their own business would be arrested for obstruction of justice, that he would personally ensure they spent the night in jail. Dorothy Ashworth didn't move an inch. Her voice was steady, carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had faced down defiant teenagers for 40 years. She said she knew wrong when she saw it, and what she was seeing was very, very wrong. Grady's eyes darted between his partner and the witnesses, the phones, the situation spiraling beyond anything he could justify in a report. Judge Chambers had maintained her composure through the illegal stop, through the humiliating search, through the degrading comments about you people. She had remained calm because that was what she had learned to do in courtrooms, full of hostile defendants and aggressive attorneys. Stay steady, document everything, let the truth speak for itself. But now, with Vickers' search complete and nothing found, she asked the only reasonable question left. Her voice was measured and clear as she asked if she was free to leave, given that she had committed no crime and his search had produced no evidence of wrongdoing. It was a lawful question, a constitutional question, the kind of question that should have ended this encounter with an embarrassed apology. Instead, it ended with blood. Something in Vickers snapped at that moment, perhaps the public challenge to his authority, perhaps the witnesses with their phones, perhaps the simple fact that this black woman had not cowered before him the way he expected. His hand shot out and grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with vicious force. Before Chambers could even cry out in pain, he drove her forward, slamming her face first into the wine shelf with enough force to send another cascade of bottles crashing to the floor. Her reading glasses flew from her face and shattered against the tile. But worse than the glasses was the sound, a sickening crack as her forehead connected with the metal edge of the shelf, splitting the skin open in a gash that immediately began streaming blood down her face. Chambers didn't resist, didn't raise a hand to defend herself, didn't struggle against his grip. Her body went limp, a survival instinct that every black person in America understands, the knowledge that resistance, even in self-defense, can be used to justify even greater violence. Vickers forced her to the ground, driving his knee into the center of her back while her blood spread across the white tile floor, mixing with the spilled wine in a pool that shoppers would later describe as looking like a crime scene. Because it was one. Mira Osei screamed, the sound piercing through the store. Franklin Doyle's voice boomed that this was assault, that he was calling 911 to report a police officer attacking an unarmed woman. Vickers, breathing heavily, his knee still pinning the bleeding judge to the floor, yelled at Grady to control the crowd, to get these people back, to stop them from recording. Grady stood frozen, doing nothing, his failure to intervene being captured by 6 cameras and 4 phones. The handcuffs bit into Judge Chambers' wrists with a cruelty that went beyond restraint. Vickers had cinched them deliberately tight, metal edges cutting into skin already raw from being wrenched behind her back, the pain sharp and immediate on top of the throbbing agony radiating from her split forehead. Blood continued streaming down her face, dripping from her chin onto her beige cardigan, staining the fabric in dark patterns that would later be photographed as evidence. Vickers hauled her to her feet with no regard for her injuries, no concern for the woman swaying unsteadily as her vision blurred from the head wound. Then he announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences, that she was under arrest for resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and assaulting a police officer. Every word was a lie. The security cameras had captured a woman who never raised her voice, never lifted a hand, never made a single movement that could be construed as resistance. But Vickers had learned over 18 years that the charges didn't need to be true, they just needed to exist on paper long enough to justify whatever he had done. Chambers, despite the blood in her eyes and the handcuffs cutting her circulation, summoned the same voice she used to silence unruly courtrooms. Clear, authoritative, and absolutely steady, she stated her full name and title for every camera and phone still recording. She was Judge Eleanor Chambers of the United States District Court for the Eastern District, and he was making a catastrophic mistake. For 1 second captured perfectly on Ethan Osei's phone, Vickers froze. Something flickered across his face, a microsecond of doubt, perhaps even fear, as the weight of what she had said began to register. Then the moment passed, and he doubled down with the desperation of a man who had gone too far to turn back. He said he didn't care if she was the Queen of England, that she was going to jail, and shoved her roughly toward the store's exit while her blood left a trail on the polished floor behind them. Raymond Castellanos had managed Harrington's Fine Foods for 19 years, working his way up from stock clerk to running one of the most profitable locations in the regional chain. He knew every employee by name, knew most of his regular customers, and had built a reputation for running a store where people felt welcomed and safe. He was in the back office reviewing inventory reports when a breathless clerk burst through the door saying there was a situation in the wine aisle, that a cop was hurting someone, that there was blood everywhere. Castellanos moved faster than he had in years, rushing through the stockroom and onto the sales floor, where the scene that greeted him stopped him cold. A woman in handcuffs, blood streaming down her face from a wound that clearly needed immediate medical attention. Shattered glass and spilled wine covering the floor of his premium wine section. A crowd of customers with phones raised, their faces showing shock and horror, and two police officers moving toward the exit with the urgency of men fleeing a crime scene rather than processing a legitimate arrest. Castellanos positioned himself directly in front of the automatic doors, blocking the only exit, his considerable frame filling the space. His voice carried the authority of a man defending his territory as he demanded to know what was happening, why a customer was bleeding, what possible justification existed for this. Vickers ordered him to step aside, threatening arrest for obstruction, but Castellanos didn't flinch. He said this was his store, that every inch of it was covered by cameras recording in 4K resolution with crystal clear audio, and that nobody was leaving until he understood why a woman was being dragged out with blood running down her face. Then he pulled out his phone and made 2 calls that would seal Vickers' fate. The first was to corporate headquarters, alerting them that a major incident was occurring that would require immediate legal involvement. The second was to a number he had saved from a community safety initiative 6 months earlier, the direct line to Police Chief Lenora Vance. As he spoke into the phone, describing what he was seeing in precise detail, the color began draining from Sergeant Vickers' face. The power dynamic in that grocery store had shifted completely, and for the first time that evening, the officer who had wielded his badge like a weapon realized he might not be able to lie his way out of what he had done. The flashing lights of Police Chief Lenora Vance's unmarked vehicle cut through the evening darkness of the Harrington's parking lot exactly 18 minutes after Raymond Castellanos ended his call. Chiefs didn't respond to routine incidents, they had captains and lieutenants for that. But there had been something in Castellanos' voice, a controlled urgency that made Vance grab her keys and drive across town herself. What she found when she walked through those automatic doors confirmed every instinct that had propelled her out of her office. A black woman in handcuffs, blood still seeping through a makeshift bandage someone had pressed to her forehead. Sergeant Dale Vickers standing rigid near the exit, his jaw set in the defensive posture of a man preparing his lies. Officer Neil Grady, pale as paper beside him, looking like he might vomit on the shattered glass still covering the floor. And a crowd of at least 15 witnesses, many still holding phones that had recorded everything, their faces reflecting a mixture of outrage and expectation. Vance had been police chief for 7 years, and she recognized a catastrophe when she saw one. Her first question to Vickers was about his body camera footage. He claimed it had malfunctioned, that it hadn't been recording properly, an excuse she had heard dozens of times from officers whose cameras mysteriously failed only during controversial incidents. She asked for a summary of what happened, and Vickers launched into a narrative about a suspicious person, about resistance, about fearing for his safety, a story so riddled with inconsistencies that it contradicted itself twice in the first 30 seconds. Before Vance could respond, Dorothy Ashworth stepped forward from the crowd, her 71 years of moral authority evident in every word. She said that woman had told the officer she was a federal judge, and he had laughed in her face. The silence that followed was absolute. Chief Vance's expression transformed from professional concern to something much harder, much more dangerous for the 2 officers standing before her. She ordered the handcuffs removed immediately, her voice leaving no room for discussion, and called for emergency medical assistance. Vickers opened his mouth to protest, perhaps to continue his fabricated narrative, but Vance silenced him with a single look that promised his career was now measured in hours rather than years. The handcuffs came off, revealing wrists already bruising purple from how tightly Vickers had cinched the metal. A paramedic unit arrived within minutes, and Judge Chambers was guided to a chair while EMTs assessed the gash on her forehead deep enough to require stitches. They said, possibly deep enough to scar permanently. While the paramedics worked, Chief Vance ordered an officer to run the identification that had been taken from Chambers' purse during the illegal search. The seconds that followed would replay in Vickers' nightmares for years to come. The officer's voice came through clearly, audible to everyone nearby, confirming that Eleanor Chambers was exactly who she had claimed to be. Not just a judge, a federal judge for the United States District Court, Eastern District. Not just any federal judge, one who had presided over 17 police misconduct cases in the past 5 years, one who had sentenced a corrupt county sheriff to 15 years in federal prison just 6 months earlier, a case that had made national headlines. One who had direct professional relationships with the Department of Justice, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and every major civil rights organization in the country. The blood drained from Vickers' face so completely he looked like a ghost standing in the fluorescent lighting of the grocery store. Chief Vance walked personally to where Judge Chambers sat, the paramedic still cleaning blood from her face, and apologized with a sincerity that everyone present recognized as genuine horror at what had occurred under her command. Chambers listened to the apology while holding a gauze pad to her still bleeding forehead, then responded with words that carried the weight of her 22 years on the federal bench. She wanted every second of security footage preserved under chain of custody protocols. She wanted every witness statement documented before anyone left the store. She wanted badge numbers, personnel files, and complaint histories for both officers. And she wanted Chief Vance to understand, with absolute clarity, that this incident would not be buried, minimized, or quietly settled. It would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. Vance turned to Vickers and Grady, her voice flat and final. Badges and weapons, now. Vickers' hand trembled as he unclipped the shield he had worn for 18 years, the shield he had used to terrorize countless citizens who didn't have the power to fight back, and placed it in his chief's outstretched hand. The videos hit the internet before Judge Chambers had even finished receiving her stitches at Millbrook General Hospital. Ethan and Mira Osei uploaded their recordings to every platform they could think of: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, with captions describing exactly what they had witnessed. Within 6 hours, the footage had been viewed over 2 million times. Within 24 hours, it crossed 10 million. Within 48 hours, the number became impossible to track as the videos were downloaded, re-uploaded, and shared across every corner of the internet. The store's security footage, subpoenaed by federal authorities within hours of the incident, was leaked to a major news network by someone whose conscience outweighed their job security. Cable news networks ran the assault on an endless loop: the shove, the impact, the blood, the handcuffs, all captured in devastating 4K clarity from multiple angles. Legal analysts who had spent careers parsing ambiguous police encounters called this one unprecedented in its clarity. One former federal prosecutor said on national television that this was one of the most clear-cut cases of police brutality and racial profiling ever recorded, that there was simply no alternative interpretation possible. The image of Judge Chambers' bloodied face captured in a still frame as Vickers hauled her to her feet became a symbol almost overnight, shared millions of times with captions about justice, about racism, about the reality of being black in America regardless of achievement or status. Civil rights leaders held press conferences on courthouse steps across the country. The governor issued a statement calling the incident deeply disturbing and demanding a full investigation. The White House press secretary was asked for comment during a daily briefing and responded that the president was monitoring the situation closely. But perhaps most damaging to the Millbrook Police Department was what investigative journalists began unearthing about Sergeant Dale Vickers himself. Those 31 sealed complaints were sealed no longer leaked by sources inside the department who had watched colleagues like Vickers operate with impunity for years. The pattern was devastating. Complaint after complaint from black residents describing the same behavior, the same language, the same escalation from routine encounters to violence. And buried in city financial records, reporters discovered something the public had never been told. The city had quietly paid out over $800,000 in settlements related to Vickers' conduct over the past decade, exposed, and there was nowhere left to hide. The FBI announced its civil rights investigation on a Friday morning. The press conference carried live on every major network. The special agent in charge stood at a podium flanked by American flags and delivered a statement that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. This was not simply an investigation into one officer's conduct, it was a comprehensive review of the Millbrook Police Department's patterns and practices regarding discriminatory policing. The Department of Justice followed within hours, announcing that the Civil Rights Division would be conducting its own parallel investigation, examining how 31 complaints against a single officer had been systematically dismissed over 18 years. By Monday morning, Sergeant Dale Vickers was arrested at his home by FBI agents, led out in handcuffs while news helicopters circled overhead and cameras captured every step. The charges were federal: assault under color of law, deprivation of civil rights, filing false official reports, and obstruction of justice for his claimed body camera malfunction, which forensic analysis revealed had been manually disabled 30 seconds before he approached Judge Chambers. Officer Neil Grady was arrested the same day, charged as an accessory for his deliberate failure to intervene during an assault he had both the duty and opportunity to stop. The state attorney general convened a grand jury to consider additional state charges, promising that no stone would be left unturned. But it was Judge Eleanor Chambers' televised statement that crystallized the moment for millions of Americans. She sat in her living room, 14 stitches visible on her forehead, the bruises on her wrists, now a deep purple, and spoke directly into the camera with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout her ordeal. She said that if this could happen to her, a federal judge with 22 years on the bench, with direct connections to every lever of power in the justice system, then Americans needed to imagine what happened every day to those without her resources, without her platform, without her ability to fight back. Her voice carried the weight of every victim whose case never went viral, whose assault was never recorded, whose complaint was dismissed and buried. This case, she said, is for them. The federal trial of Dale Vickers began on a gray Monday morning 4 months after the incident at Harrington's Fine Foods, and from the moment the prosecution began presenting evidence, everyone in that courtroom knew how it would end. The security footage was played in its entirety on large monitors positioned so the jury could see every frame, the approach, the demands, the search, the slurs, the violence, the blood. The audio was even more damning than the video, capturing Vickers' voice with crystalline clarity as he said, "You people," as he told Judge Chambers she had picked the wrong neighborhood, as he laughed at her identification of herself as a federal judge. The witnesses took the stand one by one, their accounts unwavering under cross-examination, because they were simply describing what the cameras had already proven. Dorothy Ashworth, her voice steady with righteous conviction, described watching a woman her own age being brutalized for the crime of buying wine. Franklin Doyle, his military bearing lending weight to every word, testified that in 30 years of service he had never witnessed such a clear abuse of authority. Medical experts displayed images of Judge Chambers' injuries, a fractured orbital bone that required surgical repair, a severe concussion with lasting effects, and permanent scarring on her forehead that no amount of cosmetic intervention could fully erase. Use of force specialists, including a former police chief and an FBI training instructor, testified that Vickers' actions were not merely excessive but criminal, that nothing in his training or experience could justify a single moment of what he had done to a compliant, unarmed woman. The defense tried desperately to construct a narrative of threat, claiming Vickers had genuinely feared for his safety, but the footage demolished every argument before it could take hold. The jury saw a 58-year-old woman in a cardigan, pushing a shopping cart, holding a bottle of wine, who never raised her voice or her hands, even as she was beaten and bloodied. They deliberated for just over 3 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge, a colleague of Chambers who had recused himself from the civil proceedings but presided over the criminal trial, sentenced Vickers to 12 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed under sentencing guidelines. Officer Neil Grady, who had stood silent while a woman was assaulted, who had followed unlawful orders without question, who had failed in his most basic duty to protect, received 3 years for his complicity. As Vickers was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, he passed within feet of Judge Chambers, who sat in the gallery with the same composure she had maintained throughout. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. The civil lawsuit was settled 6 weeks after the criminal verdicts, but the word settled failed to capture what Judge Eleanor Chambers had actually achieved. The monetary amount, $14.5 million, was the largest police misconduct settlement in the state's history, a number that made national headlines and sent shockwaves through municipal insurance markets nationwide. But Chambers had made clear from the beginning that money was never her primary objective. She had enough money. What she wanted was change, and she used every ounce of her legal expertise and moral authority to ensure she got it. The consent decree attached to the settlement was unprecedented in its scope and enforceability. 6 officers with complaint histories similar to Vickers' pattern were terminated immediately, their sealed files unsealed, and their victims notified. The department was required to implement mandatory body cameras with no officer-controlled off switches. The cameras would activate automatically during any civilian interaction and could only be deactivated by supervisors reviewing footage in real time. An independent civilian oversight board was established with full subpoena power, the authority to compel testimony, and the ability to recommend termination and criminal referral. All misconduct complaints would be disclosed publicly within 30 days, ending forever the department's practice of burying allegations in sealed files. And in a provision that Chambers had insisted upon personally, the department's training academy was renamed the Eleanor Chambers Center for Constitutional Policing, a permanent reminder of what happened when officers forgot who they served. Police Chief Lenora Vance, who had arrived at Harrington's that night and seen immediately the catastrophe her department had created, resigned 3 days after the settlement was announced, accepting responsibility for the institutional failures that had allowed Vickers to operate unchecked for 18 years. 4 city council members faced recall elections, 2 resigned before the votes could be held. And in the weeks following the settlement's announcement, 3 other victims of Dale Vickers came forward with stories that had never been told. A young black man stopped and beaten during a traffic stop in 2019. A black teenager detained and humiliated outside his own home in 2021. A black nurse subjected to an illegal search outside her workplace in 2022. Each received their own settlement. Each received an apology. The system that had protected Dale Vickers for nearly 2 decades was being dismantled piece by piece, and Judge Eleanor Chambers oversaw every moment of its demolition with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything in her life. 1 year to the day after a routine trip to buy wine became a nationally televised symbol of racial injustice, Judge Eleanor Chambers walked back into her courtroom. The gallery was packed with colleagues, supporters, and journalists who had followed her story from that bloody grocery store floor to this moment of return. There was something different about her now, a thin scar running along her forehead, faded but unmistakably visible. Her clerks had suggested makeup, had offered the name of an excellent cosmetic dermatologist. Chambers refused. The scar stayed visible, a permanent testament to what had happened. A reminder that justice was not an abstraction but something worth bleeding for. In the months that followed, she established the Chambers Justice Initiative, providing free legal representation to victims of police misconduct who lacked the resources to fight alone. She spoke at law schools, police academies, and congressional hearings. When interviewers asked how she felt about Dale Vickers now serving year 2 of his 12-year sentence, her answer never varied. She said she didn't think about him. What she thought about was the next person he would have hurt if those cameras hadn't been rolling. She thought about the 31 people who filed complaints before her, who had no viral videos, no national outrage, no justice. This was never about her. It was about what happens in the dark when no one is watching. The documentary about the case ended with footage that had become iconic. Vickers being led from the courthouse in handcuffs, the same restraints he had used on Judge Chambers. His head bowed as he walked toward a prison transport van. The screen faded to black, and white text appeared. 31 complaints, 18 years. One moment of truth. A final reminder that the system had been given 31 chances to stop him, and it took a federal judge bleeding on a grocery store floor before anyone finally did. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, if you're someone who lies awake at 2 or 3 a.m., mind racing, unable to shut off, I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes, your mood suffers, everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm milk, nothing worked long term. Then I found something called the 30-Day Uninterrupted Sleep Reset. It's a science-based program, no pills, no medication, that actually retrains your brain to sleep through the night. 7 to 8 hours, uninterrupted. Over 30 days, it rewires your sleep system. And once you're done, you keep the results. There's a maintenance plan so you don't slip back. Look, if you've tried everything and nothing sticks, this is different. Check the link in the description. Seriously, try it, and I'll catch you in the next story.
Sir, step aside, now!
Lower your voice. The detector didn't alert. State your reason.
You're being selected. Move!
Selection requires cause. Identify your policy.
It's a random check. Cooperate immediately, now!
Officer.
Sir, step over here.
TSA Supervisor Henry Smith thought he was protecting national security when he saw a black man in a Navy SEAL dress uniform approaching the security checkpoint at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Every biased instinct told him this couldn't be real. Stolen valor. Fake uniform. Possible terrorist impersonating military. In his mind, ordering a full tactical detention was justified. Code red security alert, backup units, armed response. He had spent 19 years with TSA building what he called instincts for spotting threats. But when he intercepted Lieutenant Commander Ruben Igwe, a decorated Navy SEAL carrying official Pentagon travel orders and wearing a chest full of medals, including the Navy Cross for valor under fire, he made a catastrophic miscalculation. What Smith didn't know was that Igwe had just returned from a classified 8-month deployment in Yemen. And every second of what followed was captured on 14 different cameras throughout the terminal, 47 civilian phones, and 6 body cameras worn by responding officers. The very surveillance systems meant to protect travelers would become the evidence that sent Smith to federal prison and cost the government $22.7 million. December 22nd, 2 days before Christmas, Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport was chaos. 247,000 passengers moving through terminals, families rushing to make connections, soldiers heading home for the holidays. Terminal D security checkpoint processed 89 travelers per minute during peak hours. Thousands of witnesses surrounded by hundreds of cameras capturing everything in sharp detail. It was the worst possible place to commit a civil rights violation, and the best possible place to document one. Lieutenant Commander Ruben Igwe was born in Chicago's South Side to Nigerian immigrant parents who had sacrificed everything for the American dream. His grandfather, Samuel Igwe, had served in Korea with the segregated army units, earning a Bronze Star while fighting for a country that didn't fully accept him. His father, Emmanuel, had deployed to Desert Storm as a Marine gunnery sergeant. Military service wasn't just a career in the Igwe family. It was a sacred tradition passed down through generations. Ruben had enlisted at 18, determined to push himself beyond any limit. He completed BUD/S training, the brutal 6-month Navy SEAL selection program with a 75% dropout rate, finishing top of his class. For 14 years, he had served in the most elite special operations unit in the world. 3 combat deployments: Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Missions so classified that even his family didn't know where he was or what he was doing. His Navy Cross, the second highest valor award in the Navy, came from an ambush in Syria where he had carried 2 wounded teammates across 400 meters of open ground under enemy fire, then returned for 4 more, 6 lives saved. His body still carried the shrapnel. Now, after 8 months in Yemen, he was finally coming home. His daughter, Amara, 7 years old, thought he was still deployed. His ex-wife, Denise, had arranged the surprise. He wore his dress blues with every medal he had earned because his Pentagon travel orders required it. He never imagined that uniform would make him a target. Henry Smith had built his 19-year TSA career on what he called instincts. His supervisors called it proactive screening. His colleagues had another name for it. Behind his back, staff at Terminal D called him the profiler. Everyone knew which passengers Smith would flag. Everyone knew the pattern, and everyone stayed silent. The numbers told the story. Over the previous 3 years, Smith had personally flagged 847 passengers for enhanced screening. Internal data obtained during discovery revealed that 89% were people of color, black men traveling in business attire, brown families with American passports, anyone who didn't fit Smith's mental image of a legitimate traveler. He had been named in 31 formal complaints alleging racial profiling and discriminatory treatment. Not a single one had resulted in meaningful discipline. His supervisors praised his vigilance while quietly settling one lawsuit for $45,000 with a confidentiality agreement that buried the evidence. Internal emails showed supervisors were fully aware of his behavior. One message from his direct manager read, "Henry flags a lot of passengers, but his instincts have caught contraband before. Let him work." Another email, responding to a discrimination complaint, stated, "Smith operates within discretionary guidelines. No action required." The system had protected him for nearly 2 decades. Smith had developed a particular obsession with what he called stolen valor cases. He believed he could spot fake military credentials instantly, especially when worn by minorities. He had stopped 14 black service members over 5 years, demanding additional verification, calling their patriotism into question. None had been fraudulent. He had never once stopped a white service member for the same scrutiny. December 22nd, 2:47 p.m., Terminal D security checkpoint. The holiday rush created a river of travelers snaking through rope lines, families juggling luggage and children, business travelers checking phones impatiently. 8 overhead cameras recorded the checkpoint from multiple angles. Audio systems designed to detect verbal threats captured every conversation. The afternoon sun streamed through the terminal's massive windows, flooding the space with natural light that made the camera footage crystal clear. Smith stood at his elevated supervisor station, scanning the approaching passengers with practiced suspicion. His eyes locked on the figure moving through the priority screening line. A black man in a Navy SEAL dress uniform, the distinctive navy blue adorned with gold insignia and ribbons. A chest full of medals that caught the overhead lights. The unmistakable Navy Cross hanging below rows of service ribbons, walking with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every decoration. Smith's jaw tightened. No way, that's real. The checkpoint audio system captured his words perfectly, his voice dripping with disbelief. He stepped down from his station, something he rarely did for routine screenings. Lieutenant Commander Igwe approached the document check podium, Pentagon travel orders in hand, Navy ID ready, everything by the book, everything legitimate. Smith intercepted him before the screening agent could process his credentials. "I'll handle this one." His body blocked the normal lane, forcing Igwe to stop. "I need to see your identification, military credentials, and travel authorization." Igwe's expression remained calm, professional, the composure of a man who had faced enemy fire without flinching. He handed over his Navy ID, his passport, and his official Pentagon travel orders bearing authentication stamps and a verification phone number. Smith examined each document, his eyes scanning for any flaw, any inconsistency. There were none. The ID was genuine. The passport was valid. The Pentagon orders were authentic, complete with the official seal and a direct verification line. Everything checked out. Any reasonable officer would have cleared him through. Instead, Smith's face hardened. These look forged. High quality, but forged. I'm calling for backup. He reached for his radio, his voice carrying across the checkpoint, loud enough for dozens of travelers to hear. Code red, Terminal D checkpoint. Possible stolen valor. Suspected forged military documents. I need armed response immediately. The code red alert triggered an immediate armed response. Within 90 seconds, 6 DFW airport police officers converged on Terminal D checkpoint, hands on holstered weapons, faces tense with adrenaline. Travelers scrambled backward, parents pulling children close, the orderly security line dissolving into chaos. The overhead cameras captured the scene from 8 different angles, every moment preserved in high-definition clarity. On the ground! Now! The lead officer's command echoed through the terminal. His body camera recorded the view directly ahead. Lieutenant Commander Ruben Igwe, standing motionless in his Navy SEAL dress uniform, hands already raised, medals glinting under the fluorescent lights. Igwe dropped to his knees, slowly, deliberately, the movements of a man trained to survive hostile situations. He lowered himself face down onto the cold terminal tile, his Navy cross pressing into the floor, his ribbons scraping against ground that thousands of feet had crossed that day. 6 officers surrounded him, weapons drawn, body cameras capturing every angle of a decorated war hero being treated like a terrorist. Smith stood back, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction. His voice carried across the checkpoint, loud enough for everyone to hear. Stolen valor, possible terrorist threat. We caught him trying to board with forged military documents. The travel orders lay scattered where they had fallen. The Pentagon verification phone number clearly visible on the authenticated letterhead. Not a single officer thought to call it. Passengers had their phones out, recording, documenting. At least 47 civilian videos would later be collected as evidence, capturing the humiliation from every conceivable angle. A black man in full military dress uniform handcuffed on an airport floor 2 days before Christmas, while hundreds of travelers watched in horror. Officers, Igwe said calmly, his voice steady despite the knee pressed into his back. I am Lieutenant Commander Ruben Igwe, United States Navy. Active duty. SEAL Team 4. Those documents are authentic. Call the Pentagon number on my orders. They will verify. Nobody called. 3 miles away, in the arrivals terminal, 7-year-old Amara Igwe held her mother's hand, bouncing with excitement. The flight status board showed her father's plane had landed 40 minutes ago. Any moment now, he would walk through those doors. The surprise she had kept secret for 2 weeks was finally happening. Daddy's coming, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the automatic doors. He's really coming home. The windowless detention room measured 10 feet by 12 feet, concrete walls painted institutional gray, a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a single camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking steadily, recording everything. The audio system captured every word spoken within those walls with perfect clarity. Igwe sat in handcuffs for 4 hours and 17 minutes. Smith entered the room periodically, each visit documented on the detention room footage. His questions weren't investigations, they were accusations. Where did you get this uniform? Who made these documents? What organization are you working with? Officer, Igwe repeated with measured patience. Call the number on my Pentagon orders. They will verify my identity in minutes. I am an active duty Navy SEAL. I have the highest security clearances in the military. This can be resolved with 1 phone call. Smith's response was captured in damning clarity. Anyone can print fake documents. Anyone can buy a costume. I've seen this before. You people think you can just put on a uniform and nobody will question it. You people. The words hung in the air, recorded for posterity. Igwe's phone had been confiscated. He couldn't call his command. He couldn't contact his ex-wife to explain why he hadn't appeared at arrivals. He couldn't tell his daughter that Daddy was coming, just delayed. 3 hours into the detention, Amara was crying in the arrivals terminal. The flight had landed ages ago. Every other passenger had come through. Her father wasn't there. Maybe he didn't want to come home. Maybe something happened. Maybe he was never coming. Denise held her daughter, fighting her own panic, calling Ruben's phone over and over, straight to voicemail every time. Inside the detention room, Smith finally ran Igwe's credentials through the federal database. The results should have ended everything immediately. The screen populated with classified flags, restricted access warnings, and security clearance indicators that only legitimate military personnel with the highest authorizations would possess. Any competent officer would have recognized this as absolute proof of legitimacy. Instead, Smith panicked. He picked up the phone and called the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. "I have a suspected terrorist in custody at DFW," he reported, his voice captured on the detention room audio. Black male with sophisticated forged military documents and what appears to be a fabricated classified identity. He's got the whole system fooled. I need immediate federal intervention. The FBI agent who took the call was a 15-year veteran named Samuel Richardson. His first question was simple. "Did you call the Pentagon verification number on his travel orders?" Silence. "Those documents have authentication stamps and a direct line," Richardson continued. "Did you attempt any standard military credential verification before detaining this individual for 4 hours?" More silence. Richardson called the Pentagon himself. The verification took 11 minutes. Lieutenant Commander Ruben Igwe, Navy SEAL Team 4, active duty, Navy Cross recipient, currently traveling on official orders following an 8-month classified deployment in Yemen. One of the most decorated special operators in the United States military. Richardson's voice went cold. "Release him, immediately, and don't let anyone involved in this detention leave that airport." FBI agent Samuel Richardson arrived at DFW Airport within 40 minutes, still wearing the Marine Corps ring he'd earned 22 years earlier. He had served 2 tours in Iraq before joining the Bureau. He understood military service, he understood sacrifice, and he understood exactly what had been done to Lieutenant Commander Igwe. The detention room camera captured Richardson's entrance, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to barely contained fury as he saw a decorated Navy SEAL still sitting in handcuffs, dress uniform wrinkled from hours on a concrete floor, medals askew on his chest. "Take those off, now." Richardson's voice left no room for negotiation. The audio recording captured every word. "This man is a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. He has a Navy Cross. He has security clearances higher than anyone in this building, and you've had him in handcuffs for over 4 hours because you couldn't make a phone call?" Smith stammered, his confidence evaporating. "The documents look suspicious. I was following protocol." "Protocol?" Richardson stepped closer, his body camera recording Smith's face. "Protocol is calling the verification number printed on official Pentagon orders. Protocol is not detaining a war hero because you decided a black man couldn't possibly be a Navy SEAL." The TSA Federal Security Director arrived 15 minutes later, summoned by Richardson's demand. Patricia Holloway had overseen DFW operations for 6 years. She walked into the detention room and stopped cold. The camera captured her expression as she processed the scene. A decorated military officer in dress blues, wrists red from handcuffs, surrounded by the evidence of catastrophic failure. What Richardson told her next made her face go pale. The Pentagon had been calling for 2 hours. Igwe's commanding officer had tried to reach TSA the moment he learned of the detention. Every call had been ignored or redirected. NCIS was aware. The Secretary of the Navy's office was aware. By the time Richardson arrived, this incident had reached the highest levels of military leadership. Igwe stood slowly when the handcuffs were finally removed. His uniform was creased and wrinkled, pressed into concrete for hours. One of his medals, a Bronze Star earned in Afghanistan, had been bent when officers forced him to the ground. He straightened his ribbons with quiet dignity, saying nothing, his silence more damning than any accusation. Richardson personally escorted him to the arrivals terminal. The walk took 7 minutes through busy airport corridors, travelers staring at the Navy SEAL in rumpled dress blues accompanied by an FBI agent. Richardson's body camera recorded every step, every glance, every whispered comment from passers-by. Amara saw him first. She had cried herself into exhaustion, slumped against her mother in a plastic airport chair, convinced her father wasn't coming. Then she looked up. "Daddy!" She ran. Igwe dropped to his knees and caught her, holding his daughter for the first time in 8 months. Denise approached slowly, her eyes moving from his wrinkled uniform to his reddened wrists to his face. Something was wrong. Something had happened. Amara pulled back, her small hands touching his wrists where the handcuff marks were still visible. Her voice was captured on Richardson's body camera, innocent confusion mixed with fear. "Daddy, why are you wearing handcuffs?" Igwe had faced enemy combatants without flinching. He had carried wounded teammates through gunfire. He had endured torture, resistance training. But his daughter's question broke something inside him. The camera recorded his eyes filling with tears, his jaw trembling as he searched for words that wouldn't come. The evidence against Henry Smith wasn't just substantial. It was overwhelming, unprecedented. The kind of documentation that civil rights attorneys dream about and defendants have nightmares over. 14 official cameras had captured the incident. 8 terminal surveillance cameras recorded the checkpoint confrontation, the code red response, the armed officers surrounding a man in military dress uniform. 6 body cameras worn by responding DFW airport police officers documented the detention from ground level, capturing Igwe's face pressed into tile, his medals scraping against the floor, his calm voice repeating that he was active duty Navy. But the official footage was only the beginning. 47 civilian phone videos were collected through social media monitoring and legal subpoenas. Travelers had recorded from every angle, uploading to Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram before they even left the terminal. The videos went viral within hours. By the time Igwe was released, the hashtag number Navy SEAL detained had been viewed 4.7 million times. In total, investigators compiled 23 hours of footage from multiple perspectives, all in high definition, all with clear audio. There was no angle left undocumented, no moment unrecorded, no possible dispute about what had happened. The audio evidence was equally damning. Checkpoint microphones had captured Smith's initial words, "No way, that's real." Radio traffic recordings revealed his code red call, blackmail, fake military uniform, high threat. Detention room audio preserved every accusation, every refusal to verify, every instance of the phrase, "you people." Internal TSA communications showed that no verification attempt had been made for 3 hours and 47 minutes. Smith had access to military credential databases. He had the Pentagon phone number printed on authenticated documents. He had chosen not to use any of them. Discovery revealed Smith's 31 prior complaints. Pattern evidence emerged showing years of discriminatory enforcement. Statistical analysis demonstrated his targeting of minority travelers. The $45,000 quiet settlement was unsealed. The internal emails showing supervisor knowledge became public record. Expert witnesses would later testify that standard military credential verification takes 4 to 7 minutes through official channels. The Pentagon logs confirmed their verification line had never been called until FBI agent Richardson intervened, 4 hours and 17 minutes after Igwe's detention began. The medical records added another dimension to the damages. Igwe, who had served 14 years in special operations without psychological incident, was hospitalized for severe PTSD episode 3 days after the airport detention. The trauma of being treated like a terrorist in his own country, in front of hundreds of witnesses, while wearing the uniform he had nearly died for, had triggered a crisis that required inpatient treatment. His psychiatrist's notes, submitted as evidence, described a decorated warrior who now flinched at airport announcements, who couldn't wear his dress uniform without panic attacks, who had nightmares about being face down on cold tile while his daughter waited for a father who never came. The FBI opened a formal civil rights investigation within 72 hours of Igwe's release. Agent Richardson personally supervised the case, assembling a team of 12 investigators who began collecting evidence from every available source. The scope expanded rapidly as the magnitude of Smith's conduct became clear. The Department of Homeland Security Inspector General launched a parallel inquiry into TSA practices at DFW Airport. Investigators discovered that Smith's 31 prior complaints had been systematically dismissed without meaningful review. Supervisors had documented awareness of his targeting patterns and done nothing. The institutional failure ran deeper than one rogue officer. Congressional attention came within a week. Senator Eleanor Vance, who chaired the Armed Services Committee, issued a public statement demanding answers. A decorated Navy SEAL with a Navy Cross was detained for 4 hours at an American airport because a TSA supervisor decided a black man couldn't possibly be a military hero. This is not a security protocol, this is racial profiling, and it happened under federal authority. The Navy issued its own formal statement defending Igwe's distinguished service. Lieutenant Commander Igwe represents the highest ideals of the United States Navy. His record is exemplary. His sacrifice for this nation is beyond question. We are deeply disturbed by his treatment and fully support any investigation into this incident. Smith was placed on administrative leave the day after the incident. He was terminated 3 weeks later when the investigation confirmed he had violated every applicable protocol, but termination was only the beginning. A federal grand jury convened 2 months after the incident. Prosecutors presented evidence of willful civil rights violations, not mere negligence or poor judgment. The footage, the audio recordings, the pattern evidence from prior complaints, the refusal to make a simple verification call, all pointed to deliberate discrimination. The indictment came down with devastating force. Henry Smith was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. 3 other TSA agents were charged as co-conspirators. They had participated in the detention without questioning Smith's authority, had helped process Igwe into the holding room, had witnessed the refusal to verify credentials, and said nothing. Their silence made them complicit. The DFW airport police officers who responded to the code red were cleared of wrongdoing. They had arrived to a reported terrorist threat and acted according to training. The false information had come from Smith. They were victims of his deception as much as instruments of Igwe's humiliation. The investigation's most damning finding concerned systemic failures. TSA had no meaningful accountability system for profiling complaints. Smith's 31 prior complaints had generated paperwork but no consequences. The $45,000 settlement had been sealed specifically to prevent pattern evidence from emerging. The institution had protected a discriminatory officer for 19 years. The trial began 14 months after Lieutenant Commander Reuben Igwe was forced face down onto the terminal floor at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The federal courthouse in Dallas was packed every day, media filling the gallery, civil rights advocates and military veterans lining up before dawn to secure seats. The nation was watching. Igwe testified on the trial's second day. He wore his Navy SEAL dress uniform, the same uniform he had worn that December afternoon. The bent Bronze Star had been replaced, but every other medal remained exactly as it had been. He wanted the jury to see precisely what Smith had seen and rejected. The video evidence was played on 6 screens positioned throughout the courtroom, synchronized to show multiple angles simultaneously. The jury watched in absolute silence for 47 minutes. They saw Smith intercept Igwe at the checkpoint. They saw the documents examined and dismissed. They saw the code red called, the armed response, the decorated SEAL ordered to the ground at gunpoint. They saw his medals pressed into airport tile. They heard his calm voice explaining who he was, over and over, ignored every time. When the footage ended, 3 jurors were crying openly. Amara Igwe testified via closed-circuit video, a accommodation granted due to her age. She was 8 years old now, a year older than the little girl who had waited in arrivals for a father who never came. Her voice was small but steady. "I thought my daddy was dead." Her words cut through the courtroom. That's why he didn't come through the doors like everyone else. Then when I saw him, he had marks on his wrists. I thought he was a criminal. I thought my daddy did something bad. She paused, her lip trembling. My daddy is a hero. He saves people. Why did they hurt him? Navy commanders testified to Igwe's heroism in sessions partially sealed for classified content. What the jury heard publicly was enough. 3 combat deployments, 6 lives saved under fire, the Navy Cross, a record of service that would humble most Americans. Smith's defense was predictable and hollow. His attorney argued he was just following protocol, protecting the airport, doing his job under difficult circumstances. He claimed the documents had appeared suspicious, that his instincts had been honed by years of experience. The prosecution destroyed this systematically. Protocol requires verification calls. You refused to make them. Protocol requires database checks. You ignored the results. Protocol does not include detaining American citizens for 4 hours based on the color of their skin. Expert witnesses testified on racial profiling, implicit bias, and constitutional rights. They explained how Smith's pattern of targeting minorities was consistent with documented discrimination, not legitimate security work. They detailed the statistical impossibility that 89% of his flagged passengers being people of color could occur by chance. 14 other victims of Smith testified about their experiences. Black businessmen pulled from security lines, brown families subjected to invasive searches, an Indian-American surgeon detained for 2 hours despite valid credentials. The pattern was undeniable. But the most devastating evidence was Smith's own words, captured on checkpoint audio, preserved forever. No way that's real. You people think you can just put on a uniform. And the phrase that sealed his fate, recorded when he thought no one important was listening. No way a black guy is really a SEAL commander. The prosecution played that audio 3 times during closing arguments. The jury heard the bias stripped of all pretense, the assumption of fraud based on nothing but skin color, the dismissal of a hero's service because it didn't match a racist's expectations. The jury deliberated for 4 days. 4 days of reviewing 23 hours of footage from 14 official cameras and 47 civilian phones. 4 days of listening to audio recordings that captured every word Smith had spoken. 4 days of examining the pattern evidence from 31 prior complaints, the statistical analysis showing 89% of his targets were people of color, the emails proving supervisors knew and did nothing. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant who had served 24 years, stood to deliver the verdict. His hands were steady, but his voice carried the weight of what he was about to say. Guilty. On all counts. The courtroom erupted. Igwe sat motionless in his dress uniform, tears streaming down his face, surrounded by family and fellow Navy SEALs who had traveled from across the country to support him. His daughter Amara, watching from the gallery with her mother, didn't fully understand what guilty meant, but she understood that the people who had hurt her daddy were being punished. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Federal Judge Raymond Foster had presided over civil rights cases for 18 years. He had never seen evidence this comprehensive or conduct this egregious. Mr. Smith, you swore an oath to protect travelers. Instead, you used your position to humiliate and demean American citizens based on the color of their skin. You detained a decorated war hero, a man who has sacrificed more for this country than you will ever understand, because your prejudice told you a black man couldn't possibly be a Navy SEAL commander. The court sentences you to 5 years in federal prison. Smith's 3 co-conspirators received sentences of 18 to 24 months each. Their silence had enabled his discrimination. Their complicity had consequences. The civil lawsuit against TSA and the Department of Homeland Security proceeded separately. The government's attorneys knew the evidence was indefensible. They had seen the footage. They had heard the audio. They had reviewed the pattern evidence that proved institutional failure. Settlement negotiations began before the civil trial's 3rd week concluded. The final number stunned the nation: $22.7 million, $12 million in compensatory damages covering Igwe's trauma, medical expenses, lost wages during his hospitalization, and permanent damage to his reputation and mental health. $10.7 million in punitive damages, calculated specifically to force systemic change within TSA. It was the largest TSA-related civil rights settlement in American history. The settlement included mandatory reforms that went far beyond financial compensation. New military verification protocols required TSA agents to call Pentagon authentication lines within 15 minutes of any credential question. Comprehensive profiling training became mandatory for all supervisors, with annual recertification requirements. Complaint review systems were overhauled, with independent investigators replacing internal review processes that had protected Smith for 19 years. An independent oversight board was established specifically for TSA discrimination complaints. Civilian members with civil rights expertise would review every allegation, with authority to recommend termination and criminal referral. The system that had buried 31 complaints against Smith would never function that way again. Lieutenant Commander Ruben Igwe used a portion of his settlement to establish the Igwe Foundation for Veterans Dignity. The organization provides free legal representation to military members facing discrimination, whether at airports, in workplaces, or in their communities. In its first 2 years, the foundation assisted 847 veterans with civil rights claims, recovering over $12 million in settlements and judgments. Igwe testified before Congress 3 times on TSA reform. He sat in his dress uniform before the House Homeland Security Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, and a joint oversight hearing, describing what had happened to him and demanding systemic change. His testimony was credited with accelerating passage of the Veterans Airport Dignity Act, which codified many of the reforms from his settlement into federal law. The case became required training material for all TSA supervisors nationwide. New hires watch the footage during their first week. They see Smith's assumptions, his refusals to verify, his treatment of a decorated hero as a criminal. They hear his words. They learn what happens when bias overrides protocol. At the press conference announcing his foundation's launch, Igwe stood beside his daughter. Amara was 9 years old now, 2 years past the Christmas, when she had waited for a father who didn't come through the arrival's door. Reporters asked her what she wanted people to know about her daddy. She stepped to the microphone, her small voice carrying across the room. "My daddy is a hero. He saved 6 people in a war. He got medals for being brave, and now he helps other soldiers who get treated badly." She paused, looking up at her father. "My daddy fights for everyone." Igwe returned to active duty after his medical leave. 6 months later, he was promoted to commander, his career continuing despite the trauma Smith had inflicted. He still serves, still deploys, still wears the uniform that had made him a target. The footage from that December afternoon lives on in law schools, police academies, and civil rights archives. Professors use it to teach constitutional law. Trainers use it to demonstrate implicit bias. Advocates use it to prove that discrimination can be documented, prosecuted, and punished. 14 cameras captured what used to be denied and dismissed. 8 terminal cameras, 6 body cameras, 47 civilian phones. In another era, Smith's word would have stood against Igwe's. The decorated hero might have been dismissed as a complainer, his trauma minimized, his experience buried alongside 31 other complaints. But the cameras were rolling, every assumption recorded, every refusal documented, every moment of humiliation preserved in high definition. The technology meant to protect security personnel became the evidence that held them accountable. Body cameras work both ways. Terminal surveillance captures everyone. And in an age when every traveler carries a phone capable of recording HD video, discrimination happens in front of witnesses who never forget, and footage that never lies. Henry Smith is serving his sentence in federal prison. He will be released in 3 years, a convicted felon, stripped of his pension, barred from federal employment forever. His name is synonymous with everything wrong with unchecked authority and racial bias. Commander Ruben Igwe continues to serve the nation that nearly broke him. His foundation has helped hundreds of veterans. His testimony has changed federal law. His daughter understands now that her father's heroism extends beyond battlefields. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.
You fit the description of a gas thief. Turn around, sir.
I paid for my gas. You're making a mistake, officer.
I said turn around. Don't make this harder than it needs to be.
I'm a Navy SEAL. You don't want to
I don't care if you're the damn president. You're being detained.
The gas pump hummed in the thick August heat as Darnell Creed swiped his card at pump number 4. It was 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night at the Sunoco station off Highway 9 Inches, Beaumont, South Carolina. The kind of humid southern evening where the air sits heavy on your skin and fluorescent lights attract clouds of insects swirling in pale circles against the dark sky. Darnell was driving his matte black Dodge Charger, paid in full, registered in his name, earned with money from a career most people couldn't survive a single day of. He was wearing gym shorts and a faded gray t-shirt. Nothing flashy, nothing suspicious, just a man stopping for gas on his way home. What Officer Troy Engram saw through the convenience store window was something entirely different. Engram, 41 years old and still in full uniform after a 12-hour shift with the Beaumont County Sheriff's Department, stood at the coffee station pouring his third cup into a styrofoam cup. He looked through the plate glass and saw a muscular black man leaning against a car that cost more than Engram made in a year. In his mind, the math didn't add up. The car was too nice. The man was too calm. Something felt wrong to him, not because anything was actually wrong, but because Troy Engram had spent 16 years deciding that black men in nice cars were problems waiting to be confirmed. What Engram didn't know was that Darnell Creed was an active-duty Navy SEAL with 4 combat deployments, a Bronze Star with Valor, and a classified service record that would make most people's knees buckle. What he also didn't know was that 8 security cameras were recording every inch of that gas station in crystal clear 4K with full audio. They were about to capture the worst mistake of his life. Engram had been with the Beaumont County Sheriff's Department for 16 years. He joined at 25, rose to patrol sergeant after 9, then was quietly demoted back to patrol after an internal investigation into an incident where a black teenager alleged Engram slammed him against the hood of his cruiser during a traffic stop. The investigation found insufficient evidence, largely because Engram's body camera had conveniently malfunctioned. No wrongdoing appeared in his file. 9 civilian complaints over 16 years, 7 from black residents. Excessive force during routine stops. Racial slurs muttered quietly enough to deny later. Illegal searches without probable cause. Fabricated charges against people who questioned his authority. Every single complaint reviewed and dismissed by an internal affairs division run by Sergeant Dale Fenton, Engram's former patrol partner and the best man at his wedding. Complaints came in, sat for the mandatory review period, received a form letter, conclusion of unsubstantiated, and disappeared into a filing cabinet no one ever opened. He was named in 2 prior civil lawsuits, both filed by black men alleging unlawful detention and excessive force. Both settled quietly with sealed records and no admission of wrongdoing. Engram never paid $1, never missed a shift. He coached his son's Little League team. He taught Sunday school. And he terrorized black residents with impunity because the system had told him over and over that he could. Tonight, he was stopping for coffee after a long shift. Tired, irritable, armed with his department-issued Glock 19, badge still clipped to his belt. The moment he looked through that window and saw Darnell Creed leaning against the Charger, his entire posture changed. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightened. He set down the coffee and walked toward the door. Every step captured on the interior camera, every step carrying him toward the encounter that would destroy everything he thought his badge protected him from. The main exterior camera captured Engram pushing through the store's glass door and walking directly toward Pump 4. His approach was deliberate, aggressive, his right hand already drifting to rest on his hip near the Glock. He stopped 6 feet from Darnell, positioning himself between the car and the pump in a way that blocked any easy exit. The camera above the awning recorded his face, jaw set, eyes hard, a man who had already made his decision before opening his mouth. "This your car?" Darnell looked up from his phone, the pump nozzle still in his left hand, fuel still flowing into the Charger's tank. He registered the uniform, the badge, the posture, and every instinct trained into him across a decade of combat operations activated simultaneously. Assess. Remain calm. Control the encounter. "Yes, sir, it's mine," he said, his voice even and respectful. Ingram wasn't satisfied. He asked where Darnell got it. Darnell said he bought it. Ingram asked where he worked, how he could afford a car like that, whether the vehicle was stolen. Each question landed heavier than the last, more invasive, more accusatory, each one built on the assumption that a black man standing next to an expensive car owed a stranger in uniform an explanation for his own property. Darnell answered every question with controlled patience, never raising his voice, never making sudden movements, calmly repeating that he was a customer pumping gas, that he'd committed no crime, that he hadn't been told what he was suspected of. He was building a verbal record the same way he'd build a situation report in hostile territory, precise, deliberate, documented. Ingram didn't care. He'd already decided Darnell was guilty of something. The cameras captured it all. 2 men at a gas pump, one radiating aggression, one radiating the kind of discipline that keeps you alive in war zones but cannot protect you from a badge and a bias. The gas station wasn't empty, and what happened next would have unfolded very differently if it had been. Frank and Diane Kowalski, a white couple in their early 52nds, were parked at Pump 3 finishing their own fill-up when Ingram approached Darnell. Frank had been cleaning his windshield. He stopped mid-wipe when he heard the tone in Ingram's voice, that particular edge of authority that crosses into something uglier. Diane, still in the passenger seat, leaned forward to watch through the windshield, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. Inside the store, Sophia Reyes, 24, a nursing student on her way home from a 12-hour night shift at Beaumont General, was paying for gas at the register when the confrontation began. She turned toward the window and watched Ingram's posture, watched his hand resting near his weapon, watched Darnell's deliberate stillness. She recognized what she was seeing immediately. In the parking lot, sitting in a faded pickup truck eating a sandwich he'd bought from the store 10 minutes earlier, Clyde Abernathy watched in silence. Clyde was 67 years old, a retired postal worker who had lived in Beaumont County his entire life. He didn't own a smartphone. He couldn't record what was happening. But he watched with the quiet intensity of a man who had seen this exact scene play out in 50 different ways across 50 years and knew exactly how it could end. Behind the counter, Hector Nunez, the 22-year-old clerk, glanced at the security monitors, showing all 8 camera feeds simultaneously, and quietly began backing up the footage to a secondary drive. His manager had trained him to do this whenever police interactions happened on the property. One by one, cell phones came out. Sophia started recording through the glass. Frank stepped away from his car and recorded from the adjacent pump. The audience for Ingram's performance was growing, and he didn't care. Ingram's next words came out as a command, not a request. "Let me see some ID." Darnell didn't argue. He announced every movement before he made it, loud enough for the cameras, loud enough for the witnesses. "I'm reaching into my back pocket for my wallet. My hands are visible. I'm moving slowly." He pulled out his wallet, extracted his South Carolina driver's license, and held it out with his fingers spread wide, the card visible between his thumb and forefinger. Ingram snatched it from his hand with unnecessary force, the motion captured on the overhead pump camera in sharp detail. He studied the license for an unreasonable amount of time, turning it over, comparing the photo to Darnell's face, checking the address, looking for something, anything, that would justify what he was doing. He found nothing. The license was valid, the address was local, the photo matched, everything was clean. Instead of returning it and walking away, he escalated. "Put your hands on the vehicle." Darnell's voice remained steady. "What crime am I being detained for, officer?" Ingram didn't answer. He repeated the command louder, his voice echoing across the station. Darnell complied, placing both palms flat on the Charger's roof, but stated clearly, "I do not consent to any search. I have not been informed of any crime." The search was violent. Ingram slammed Darnell's face against the roof of the Charger, grinding his cheek into metal that had been baking in August heat all day. He kicked Darnell's feet apart so wide he nearly lost balance. He emptied his pockets, wallet, phone, car keys, a protein bar, throwing each item onto the concrete. He popped the trunk without consent or warrant, rifled through a gym bag containing workout clothes and military-grade boots. Found nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no contraband. Just the belongings of a man who serves his country. The overhead camera captured every second. The awning camera caught Darnell's face. Eyes closed, jaw clenched, a man using every ounce of discipline not to react. Should police officers be allowed to search someone without probable cause simply because of the car they drive? Comment below. Ingram stepped back from the trunk and slammed it shut. He had nothing. No contraband, no weapons, no stolen property, no evidence of any crime whatsoever. His justification for the stop was evaporating in real time, and the frustration was written across his face, captured in perfect detail by the awning camera positioned just 8 feet above him. Every officer who has ever conducted a baseless stop knows this moment. The moment where the smart move is to hand back the ID, mutter something about routine checks, and walk away before the situation gets worse. Ingram didn't make the smart move. He leaned in close to Darnell, who was still pressed against the charger with his palms flat on the roof. The awning camera's microphone captured what came next with devastating clarity. Ingram told Darnell that people like you don't belong in this neighborhood after dark, that he knew Darnell was up to something, that next time he wouldn't be so polite about it. The words hung in the humid air, recorded from multiple angles, impossible to deny, impossible to reinterpret. Darnell's response was quiet, controlled, and it changed everything. I've served 4 combat tours, protecting this country. I have a Bronze Star. I've bled for people who look like you and people who look like me, and you're telling me I don't belong at a gas station. Ingram froze. For 2 full seconds, captured in perfect clarity on the awning camera, his face registered something between shock and rage. He didn't expect credentials. He didn't expect calm, articulate resistance from a man he'd already categorized as a threat. He didn't expect a warrior. Then the shock hardened into something worse, and he made the decision that would end his career, his freedom, and his life as he knew it. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. The cameras captured every frame. Ingram grabbed Darnell by the back of the neck with both hands and ripped him away from the car. Darnell's palms left the roof of the Charger, and before he could even process what was happening, Ingram drove him face first into the concrete. The impact was audible on 4 different audio feeds. A sickening crack that echoed across the station and made Sophia Reyes flinch behind her phone screen. Darnell's forehead split open on the pavement, blood pooling immediately, bright red under the fluorescent lights, spreading across the gray concrete in a shape the overhead camera recorded with horrible clarity. Ingram dropped a knee into Darnell's back, pinning him down with his full weight, shouting commands that contradicted each other. "Don't move," followed immediately by, "Put your hands behind your back." Darnell, bleeding and disoriented, his vision blurring from the impact, tried to comply with the second command. Ingram wrenched his arms back with enough force to partially dislocate his left shoulder. The handcuffs went on so tight they bit into skin and would leave scars that Darnell would carry for the rest of his life. Frank Kowalski was screaming from 10 feet away. "You're going to kill him! Stop! Somebody help him!" Diane was on the phone with 911, sobbing, reporting that a police officer was assaulting someone at the Sunoco on Highway 9. Sophia had moved outside, still recording, her hands shaking so badly the footage vibrated, but every frame was usable. Clyde Abernathy had gotten out of his truck and stood 20 feet away, tears streaming down his weathered face, watching history repeat itself one more time. Inside, Hector had already called his manager and corporate security. The 8 cameras never blinked. They recorded everything. They didn't look away. They couldn't. Backup arrived 11 minutes later. 2 on-duty deputies from the Beaumont County Sheriff's Department pulled into the station with lights flashing and found Darnell Creed face down on the concrete in a pool of his own blood, handcuffed, completely still, not resisting. Engram was standing over him, breathing hard, sweat soaking through his uniform, his right hand still resting on his hip near the Glock he had never needed to draw because the man beneath him had never once fought back. Engram started talking the moment the deputies stepped out of their cruiser. He told them Darnell had reached for his weapon, that he'd resisted lawful commands, that he'd been aggressive and non-compliant during a routine stop. The lies came easily, practiced, delivered with the confidence of a man who had never been contradicted by evidence before. The deputies took his word initially, the blue wall holding firm the way it always had. They loaded Darnell into the back of a cruiser without medical attention, without cleaning the blood still running down his face, without asking him a single question about what had happened. Then Frank Kowalski stepped forward. He walked directly up to the senior deputy and spoke point blank. "Everything that man just told you is a lie. I watched the whole thing from 10 feet away. That man never moved, never resisted, never reached for anything. Your officer beat him for being black at a gas station. And there are 8 cameras and 4 cell phones that prove it." The deputies hesitated. Sophia walked up and offered to show them her recording right there. Diane told them 911 had a recording of her call describing the assault in real time as it happened. And Clyde Abernathy, quietly, with the gravity of a man who had waited decades for someone to listen, said, "I've seen this my whole life. This is the first time there might actually be proof." The senior deputy looked at the blood on the concrete, at the phones still recording, at the cameras mounted on every corner of the station. He reached for his radio. Something had shifted. Hector's manager arrived within the hour. He didn't hand the footage to the sheriff's department. He handed it directly to investigators from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, called in after the 911 recordings and witness pressure made it impossible for Beaumont County to handle the case internally. The footage was catastrophic for Engram. 8 angles, 4K resolution, full audio. Every single camera told the same story. A man pumping gas, approached without cause, interrogated without justification, searched without consent, brutalized without provocation. The overhead pump camera showed the neck grab and the slam in sickening detail. Darnell's head bouncing off concrete with an impact that made investigators wince when they watched it for the first time. The awning camera captured "people like you" with studio-quality audio clarity. The interior camera showed Hector watching in real-time horror, already backing up the files to the secondary drive. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation, no angle that told a different story. There was only a police officer committing aggravated assault on an innocent man, while 8 cameras recorded his every move. When SLED investigators pulled Darnell's military records, the case became a national story overnight. An active-duty Navy SEAL with 4 combat deployments and a Bronze Star with Valor assaulted at a gas station for the crime of existing while black. Sophia's cell phone footage hit the internet first. 2 million views in 48 hours, then 10 million. Then the numbers stopped mattering because every major news outlet in the country was running the story. The gas station footage followed when SLED released selected clips during a press conference. The image of Darnell's blood on that concrete, bright red under fluorescent lights became the photograph that defined the case. And somewhere in Beaumont County, Troy Engram watched his life unravel on every screen in America. Engram was arrested 9 days after the assault, charged with aggravated assault under color of law, deprivation of civil rights under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, and filing a false police report. His bond was set at $250,000. He posted it with his house. SLED's investigation expanded rapidly. They subpoenaed every complaint ever filed against Engram, unsealed the 2 prior lawsuit settlements, and interviewed 31 prior victims who came forward once they learned there was finally video evidence that someone might actually listen. The pattern was staggering. 16 years of targeting black motorists, fabricating probable cause, conducting illegal searches, and using force against anyone who questioned his authority. The federal trial lasted 4 weeks. prosecutors played the gas station footage on the first day and the last day. In between, they called 14 prior victims to the stand, each telling a version of the same story. Stopped for nothing, searched for nothing, brutalized for nothing, believed by no one, until now. Darnell testified for 6 hours across 2 days. He never raised his voice. He described the assault with military precision, timestamps, positions, force vectors, exactly how a SEAL debriefs an engagement. He described the moment his face hit concrete and he made the conscious decision not to fight back, knowing that if he used his training to defend himself, he'd either be shot or charged with assaulting an officer. "I've been trained to neutralize threats in under 3 seconds," he told the jury, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on them. That night, the threat was wearing a badge, and I knew that if I protected myself the way I've been trained, I'd be dead or in prison. So I let him break me open on that concrete, and the cameras saw what happened. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. The verdict came back on a Thursday morning, guilty on all counts. You could hear the gasp from the hallway. The sentencing hearing lasted 1 day. The judge called Engram's conduct a disgrace to the badge and a stain on every officer who serves honorably. 7 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences for a single victim police assault case in South Carolina history. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. Troy Engram would never carry a badge again. The civil lawsuit proceeded separately. Darnell's attorney, a relentless civil rights litigator named Monique Desmond, who had built her career dismantling departments that protected violent officers, sued Engram personally, the Beaumont County Sheriff's Department, and the county itself. The claims were devastating: civil rights violations, failure to supervise, deliberate indifference to a documented pattern of misconduct, negligent retention of a known dangerous officer. The county fought it for 5 months, then settled abruptly when their own attorneys told them the footage made a trial unwinnable. The settlement was $4.7 million, $2.1 million in compensatory damages for Darnell's injuries, a fractured orbital bone, a partially dislocated shoulder, nerve damage in both wrists from handcuffs applied with punitive force, and PTSD that a man who survived 4 combat deployments never had until a cop slammed him into concrete at a gas station. $2.6 million in punitive damages, calculated specifically to punish the county for 16 years of looking the other way while Troy Engram destroyed lives. The settlement mandated sweeping reforms: an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena power, mandatory bias training with annual certification, body camera requirements for all interactions including off-duty officers in uniform, quarterly public reporting of use of force demographics, and a zero-tolerance policy for complaints involving racial language or profiling. Beaumont County would never operate the same way again. The cost of protecting Troy Engram had finally come due. Darnell used $1.5 million of his settlement to establish the Creed Foundation, a legal defense fund providing free representation to victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford attorneys. He partnered with law schools across South Carolina to create a clinic where students handled civil rights cases under faculty supervision. He spoke at the Naval Academy, at police academies, at community centers in neighborhoods where people had stopped believing the system could ever work for them. He spoke not with anger but with the quiet authority of a man who had seen violence from every angle and understood that accountability is the only thing that separates justice from tyranny. The gas station footage became required viewing at SLED's training academy. Hector Nunez, the clerk who backed up the footage to a secondary drive because his manager had trained him to protect the evidence, received a Community Service Award from the NAACP. Frank and Diane Kowalski testified at the state legislature in support of a bill mandating independent investigation of all police use of force incidents. Sophia Reyes finished nursing school and volunteered at a free clinic Darnell helped fund. And Clyde Abernathy, the 67-year-old retired postal worker who had watched from his truck with tears on his face, gave one interview to a local paper. "I've been waiting my whole life to see one of these go the right way," he said. "That young man bled on that concrete so the cameras could see the truth. And for the first time, somebody listened. Engram sits in federal prison, still insisting he did nothing wrong. The 8 cameras disagree. If you believe that officers who assault innocent people deserve prison time, that security cameras don't lie, and that standing your ground with dignity should never cost you your blood, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Tomorrow we have another story that proves the truth always finds a way to surface, because the cameras were rolling and they saw everything. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, if you're someone who lies awake at 2 or 3 a.m., mind racing, unable to shut off, I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes, your mood suffers, everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm...
Sir, step away from the table and show me your ID. Now!
Officer, excuse me, I'm Commander Elijah Okonkwo, United States Navy. This is my dress uniform.
I don't care who you claim to be. Get up or I make you get up.
I've committed no crime. I'm asking for your badge
Stand
number
up!
and your supervisor.
Now!
Officer Dale Hendricks thought he was responding to a credible threat. Anonymous tip. Suspicious armed black male inside an upscale restaurant. Possible stolen military uniform. In his mind, confronting the suspect was standard protocol, the kind of call he'd handled dozens of times before, approaching people who didn't belong in places they had no business being. Never questioned, never challenged. But when he walked into Magnolia House on a warm Saturday evening and approached the black man in full navy dress whites, sitting across from his elderly mother at a candlelit table, he made a catastrophic miscalculation. Commander Elijah Okonkwo, a 38-year-old decorated Navy SEAL with 19 years of active duty service, a Silver Star recipient who had bled for his country in 4 combat zones, born and raised in rural Georgia, knew exactly what was happening the moment Hendricks locked eyes on him and walked past every white patron in the restaurant. And what Hendricks didn't know, what he'd completely disregarded in his rush to confront the only black man in the dining room, was that his body camera was recording everything. Every word, every gesture, every moment of racial profiling captured in high-definition video with crystal-clear audio. That footage, combined with 14 CCTV cameras inside Magnolia House recording from every conceivable angle, would eventually reach the White House, trigger a federal investigation, and cost Hendricks 52 years of his life in federal prison. Hendricks had been with the Kensington Police Department for 16 years, building what his supervisors called an exemplary record of proactive community enforcement. But beneath that reputation lay 31 civilian complaints, 27 of them involving people of color, each one alleging racial profiling, discriminatory enforcement, and constitutional violations. Every complaint had been reviewed by Internal Affairs and dismissed as unfounded. His supervisors praised his zero-tolerance approach, his willingness to make stops that other officers avoided. Fellow officers had given him a nickname, the Gatekeeper, for his habit of removing minorities from businesses, restaurants, and public spaces based on nothing more than how they looked. In reality, Hendricks operated on the assumption that his badge granted him absolute authority, that the rights guaranteed by the Constitution didn't apply when his instincts told him someone was out of place. He had been recorded on body camera using racial slurs during traffic stops, but the footage had been buried by a department that valued aggressive policing over accountability. He had stopped, detained, and humiliated dozens of black and brown citizens over 16 years, and not once had he faced meaningful discipline. Until that Saturday evening at Magnolia House, no one had held him accountable, and Hendricks believed no one ever would. Commander Elijah Okonkwo had spent 19 years defending the country that was about to treat him like a criminal. 4 combat deployments: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, each one etching scars, both visible and invisible, into a man who had given everything in service to his nation. He had earned the Silver Star for extracting 3 wounded Marines from a collapsing compound in Kandahar under withering enemy fire. carrying the last one 400 meters on his back while taking rounds from 2 directions. He had received the Purple Heart after shrapnel tore through his shoulder during a firefight in Fallujah, spending 3 months in recovery before volunteering to redeploy. He had led classified operations that would never make the news, trained foreign special forces units across 3 continents, and been personally commended by 2 secretaries of defense for exceptional valor and leadership. But before he was Commander Okonkwo, he was just Elijah, a skinny kid growing up in poverty in rural Georgia, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. Lillian Okonkwo had been a school teacher for 34 years, spending her days educating other people's children and her nights making sure her own son had every opportunity she never did. She sacrificed vacations, new clothes, her own comfort, everything funneled into Elijah's future. And when he earned his commission and pinned on his SEAL trident, she cried for 3 hours straight. Now Lillian was turning 70, and Elijah wanted to give her something she'd never had. A dinner at Magnolia House, the fine dining restaurant she'd seen in magazines for years but never imagined she'd visit. This was his gift to her, a celebration of the woman who made everything possible. Magnolia House sat on the corner of Broad and Lafayette in Kensington, Virginia, a historic fine dining establishment that had served the area's wealthiest families for over 40 years. White tablecloths, crystal stemware, soft piano music drifting through a dining room designed to feel like old Southern money. The clientele skewed wealthy and almost exclusively white, the kind of place where reservations were made weeks in advance and the dress code was strictly enforced. The restaurant had an extensive security camera system, 14 CCTV cameras covering every angle of the dining room, bar, entrance, kitchen, and parking lot in ultra-high definition, installed 2 years earlier after a break-in. Those cameras recorded continuously, capturing every table, every interaction, every moment in crystal-clear detail. Commander Okonkwo and his mother were seated at a window table at 6:45 p.m., the evening light filtering through sheer curtains. He was in full navy dress whites, his medals gleaming under the chandeliers, the silver star and purple heart catching the warm light every time he moved. Lillian sat across from him in the dress she had bought specifically for this occasion, a deep blue number she'd picked out 3 weeks earlier, her eyes wide as she studied the leather-bound menu. Their server, a young woman named Carolyn Voss, later testified under oath that Commander Okonkwo and his mother were the most polite and gracious customers she had ever served in 4 years at Magnolia House. They said please and thank you for everything, Voss would tell the jury. He pulled out his mother's chair. He asked me about my day. They were lovely people. They were just happy to be there together. The call had come in at 7:12 p.m., anonymous complaint. Suspicious armed black male inside Magnolia House, possibly wearing a stolen military uniform. No specifics, no evidence, just vague accusations that should have been investigated before any action was taken. But Hendricks didn't wait. He grabbed his partner, Officer Tara Linden, and headed to the restaurant. Both officers activated their body cameras as they stepped out of the patrol car at 7:31 p.m. Hendricks pushed through the front door, his camera capturing the elegant dining room, dozens of patrons enjoying their meals in quiet conversation. He didn't stop at the hostess stand. He didn't speak to the manager. His body camera showed him walking directly past every white patron in the restaurant, straight toward the only black man in the dining room. "I need to see your identification," Hendricks said, his voice carrying across nearby tables. "We've received a report about someone wearing a stolen military uniform." Okonkwo's jaw tightened, but 19 years of military discipline held. "Officer, I'm Commander Elijah Okonkwo, United States Navy. This is my dress uniform." He reached slowly into his jacket and produced his active duty military ID and Department of Defense credentials, holding them up in the chandelier light. The photo, the name, the rank, the DoD seal, all clearly visible on both body cameras and 9 CCTV angles. Hendricks barely glanced at them. His camera recorded his eyes moving away almost immediately. "These could be fake," he said. "Anyone can buy a costume online." Costume. Lillian's eyes filled with tears. Linden shifted uncomfortably, her camera wavering. She could see the silver star and purple heart on Okonkwo's chest, decorations no costume shop could replicate, but she said nothing. "Officer, I'd like your badge number and I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Okonkwo said, his voice controlled. Hendricks' face flushed. "Stop playing, soldier. Walk out or I help you out. Your choice." What happened next was captured from every conceivable angle. 2 body cameras, 9 CCTV cameras, and 12 patrons who pulled out their phones the moment Hendricks raised his voice. Okonkwo sat with his hands flat on the table, deliberate non-aggression visible on every camera in the room. "Officer, I'm not leaving. I haven't committed a crime," Hendricks snapped. His body camera lurched forward as he grabbed Okonkwo by the arm and attempted to wrench him from the chair. Okonkwo instinctively braced, his body locking against the force, a reflexive response hardwired by 2 decades of combat training. Lyndon's camera clearly showed his hands still flat on the table. "He's resisting," Hendricks shouted into his radio. "I need backup at Magnolia House." He didn't wait. He grabbed Okonkwo with both hands and slammed him face first onto the table. Plates shattered. Glasses exploded. A decorated war hero's face driven into the surface where moments earlier he'd been celebrating his mother's 70th birthday. Lillian screamed. The sound captured on every audio feed in the room. Hendricks cuffed Okonkwo with such force the metal bit into his wrists, drawing blood. His dress uniform tore at the shoulder. His medals were ripped from his chest, the silver star, the purple heart, scattering across the hardwood floor. Then the CCTV captured something that would play on every news network in the country. As Hendricks dragged Okonkwo toward the door, he stepped directly on the fallen silver star, the medal awarded for extracting wounded Marines under enemy fire, crushed under the boot of an officer who couldn't be bothered to check a military ID. Behind them, Lillian collapsed in the booth, clutching her chest, a cardiac episode. An ambulance was called for her while her son was dragged out in handcuffs, his torn uniform stained with food and blood, his medals scattered across the floor of the restaurant where he'd come to give his mother the birthday she deserved. Okonkwo was transported to Kensington Police Department and processed into a holding cell at 8:14 p.m. He would remain there for 11 hours. Hendricks booked him on 4 charges: resisting arrest, assault on a police officer, trespassing, and stolen valor, every single one fabricated, every single one contradicted by the body camera footage already stored on department servers. Okonkwo requested his phone call immediately. He was denied. He requested again at 9 p.m., denied. Again at 10, denied. 4 hours passed before he was allowed to contact anyone, a violation of his constitutional rights documented on the holding cell surveillance cameras that recorded continuously in high definition. But the surveillance captured something far worse. During booking, Hendricks stood outside the holding cell with 2 other officers, clearly visible on camera, and mocked Okonkwo's torn uniform. "These people think they can put on a costume and sit wherever they want," he said, laughing. The audio captured every word. The other officers laughed with him. Meanwhile, 6 miles away, Lillian Okonkwo lay in a hospital bed at Kensington Memorial, alone and terrified. The cardiac episode triggered by watching her son's arrest had been diagnosed as an acute cardiac event requiring monitoring and medication. She asked repeatedly about her son. No one had answers. No one from the police department contacted the hospital. No one told Okonkwo his mother had been hospitalized. He sat in a holding cell on fabricated charges while his 70-year-old mother lay in a cardiac unit wondering if her son was alive. But someone at Kensington PD had a conscience. Officer Tara Linden, visibly disturbed by everything she had witnessed, quietly stepped outside during a break and made a phone call to Naval Station Norfolk. She identified herself, described what had happened, and provided Commander Okonkwo's name and service details. That single phone call would set in motion a chain of events that Dale Hendricks never saw coming. The United States Navy does not abandon its own. Within 2 hours of Linden's call, Naval Station Norfolk had verified Commander Okonkwo's identity, his service record, his security clearance, and his active duty status. His commanding officer, Rear Admiral Franklin Dubois, was briefed at his home at 11:47 p.m. By midnight, the admiral was on the phone with Kensington Police Department. The call was recorded on the department's phone system. Dubois' voice was controlled but barely contained fury, radiated through every word. "You are currently holding Commander Elijah Okonkwo, a decorated Navy SEAL with 19 years of service to this country, a Silver Star and Purple Heart recipient, on charges that are demonstrably false. I am directing you to release him immediately. If he is not released within the hour, I will be contacting the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, and the Judge Advocate General's office." The desk sergeant panicked. Calls went up the chain. Hendricks was pulled from his home at 1 a.m. and told to drop all charges immediately. He protested, insisted the arrest was legitimate. But the damage was already done. Every moment had been recorded. Body cameras, CCTV, holding cell surveillance, the department's own phone system. Okonkwo was released at 3:26 a.m., still in his torn dress uniform, and driven directly to his mother's hospital room by Officer Linden, who never spoke to Hendricks again. By morning, the story had leaked. A Navy SEAL in dress whites arrested for eating dinner with his mother. Restaurant patrons had uploaded their phone footage overnight. 40 million views in 48 hours. Veterans organizations mobilized nationwide. Congressional offices flooded Kensington PD with calls. The Pentagon issued a formal statement calling the arrest deeply disturbing. Cable news ran the footage on loop. Then the White House called. The president was briefed on the incident during a morning intelligence summary. According to senior staff, he was furious. Within hours, the White House issued a public statement that ricocheted across every news outlet in the country. What happened to Commander Okonkwo is a disgrace to the nation he has spent his life defending. No American, especially one who has bled for this country, should be brutalized for the color of their skin. The president personally called Commander Okonkwo and his mother at Kensington Memorial Hospital. The call lasted 2 minutes. Lillian later said she cried the entire time. The Department of Justice opened a federal civil rights investigation the same day. FBI agents arrived at Kensington Police Department at 6 a.m. the following morning with federal warrants. They seized every body camera server, every CCTV recording from Magnolia House, all internal communications, personnel files, disciplinary records, and citizen complaint archives going back 20 years. What federal investigators found went far beyond one officer and one arrest. Over 200 civilian complaints had been filed against Kensington PD officers over 2 decades, the overwhelming majority involving people of color. Complaints had been systematically buried. Evidence had been destroyed. Body camera footage from disputed interactions had been marked as corrupted or lost on at least 48 separate occasions. Internal affairs investigations had been closed without interviews, without evidence review, without accountability. The pattern was undeniable. Kensington PD had operated for years as a department that protected its officers at the expense of the communities they served, enabling racial profiling through institutional indifference and deliberate cover-ups. The investigation expanded from Dale Hendricks to his supervisors, to internal affairs, to the department's entire chain of command. What started as one officer arresting one man at one restaurant had exposed a system of systemic discrimination that reached every level of the department. The Department of Justice brought sweeping federal charges. Hendricks faced 14 counts: conspiracy to deprive civil rights under 18 U.S.C. Section 241, deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, falsifying police reports, evidence tampering, and assault. 3 of his supervisors were charged as co-conspirators for enabling and covering up years of racial profiling, burying complaints, and destroying body camera evidence. The trial became a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed every single day, media filling the back rows, veterans in uniform lining up before dawn to secure seats, civil rights advocates and military families who saw this case as a referendum on whether service to country meant anything when your skin was the wrong color. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Body camera footage from both Hendricks and Linden played on courtroom monitors in devastating clarity. All 14 CCTV angles from Magnolia House were presented simultaneously on split screens. The holding cell surveillance showed Hendricks mocking Okonkwo's uniform. The recorded phone call from Rear Admiral Dubois was played through the courtroom speakers. Then 67 prior victims of Hendricks' discrimination testified, one after another, describing the same pattern of targeting, humiliation, and fabricated charges. Commander Okonkwo testified in full dress uniform, his medals restored to his chest. He described every deployment, every wound sustained for his country, the shrapnel in Fallujah, the firefight in Kandahar. Then he described being called boy, having his face slammed into a table in front of his mother, his medals ripped from his chest and crushed under an officer's boot. Lillian testified from a wheelchair, her voice trembling but unbroken, describing watching her son, a man who had survived 4 combat zones, brutalized by police over a birthday dinner. The defense argued Hendricks acted on a legitimate anonymous tip. The prosecution played the footage. There was no rebuttal. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman, a retired firefighter, stood and read the verdict, guilty on all 14 counts. The courtroom erupted. Veterans in the gallery stood at attention. Lillian collapsed into her son's arms, sobbing. Hendricks sat motionless, staring at the table, the reality of what he had done finally catching up to him. At sentencing, Judge Raymond Cortez, a retired Marine who had served 2 tours in Vietnam, delivered a statement that would be quoted in law schools for decades. Commander Okonkwo swore an oath to defend this nation and honored that oath with his blood, his body, and 19 years of his life. Officer Hendricks swore an oath to protect and serve, and he violated that oath every single day he wore the badge. He brutalized a war hero. He terrorized an elderly woman on her birthday. He mocked a uniform that better men than him have died wearing, and he did it all while his own camera recorded the evidence. This court will ensure that the cost of that betrayal is felt for the rest of his natural life. Hendricks received 52 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. His 3 supervisors received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years for conspiracy and cover-up. The civil lawsuit filed by Commander Okonkwo settled for $34.7 million, the largest individual civil rights settlement in Virginia history. The Kensington Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree with a DOJ-appointed monitor overseeing every aspect of department operations. 14 officers were terminated. Internal Affairs was dissolved and rebuilt with civilian oversight. The department that had protected Dale Hendricks for 16 years was essentially dismantled and reconstructed from the ground up. Commander Okonkwo used a portion of his settlement to establish the Okonkwo Veterans Civil Rights Foundation, providing free legal representation to service members and veterans facing discrimination. He testified before Congress, spoke at military academies, and became a national voice for accountability, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. 3 months after the verdict, he received an invitation to the White House. The ceremony was held in the East Room, cameras from every major network broadcasting live. The president presented Commander Okonkwo with the Presidential Citizens Medal, the nation's second highest civilian honor. Lillian Okonkwo, fully recovered, sat in the front row in the same blue dress she had worn to Magnolia House, this time with tears of pride instead of terror. Magnolia House installed a permanent display near the window table where the arrest had taken place, a framed photo of Commander Okonkwo in full dress whites alongside a plaque reading, "This table is dedicated to Commander Elijah Okonkwo, who served his country with honor and was failed by those sworn to protect him. All are welcome here." The combined body camera, CCTV, and surveillance footage became required study material at the FBI Academy, at military academies across the country, and in police training programs nationwide. A case study in how racial bias, institutional cover-up, and unchecked authority destroy lives and departments. Hendricks, from his cell in a federal penitentiary, never apologized, never acknowledged wrongdoing. never expressed remorse for the metals he crushed under his boot, or the mother he put in the hospital, or the 67 other lives he damaged over 16 years of unchecked power. And in the end, it was his own body camera, the device he trusted to protect him, that became the instrument of his downfall, capturing in unforgiving detail the moment a decorated war hero was brutalized for the color of his skin while wearing the uniform of the country he nearly died defending. If you believe that those who serve this nation deserve to be treated with dignity, that racial profiling has no place in law enforcement, and that body cameras must serve justice for everyone, this case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.
Equity is an ongoing path, and information is your greatest armor. We appreciate your viewership and dedication to undeniable truth.